beer has been a fan-favorite beverage for Canadian adults for decades, thus allowing breweries to create many varieties of beer and make it easily accessible for consumers. However, it is extremely beneficial to those interested in purchasing beer to have a better understanding on how that 2-4 got on the shelf. Before the final product of beer comes to be, the supply chain starts with barley, then follows 4 main steps, the first being the farm input, which is centered around the growth of barley. This starts at seed selection and finishes at harvest. The grain is then transported to be malted, which first cleans and sizes the individual grains, then takes them through a 3-step process, which is steeping, germination, and kilning. Once kilned, the barley grain is now considered to be malt, and the malt is sent to a brewery, which turns the malt into beer and then can be canned and marketed. Beer can be bought at breweries and restaurants, but today we will focus on the purchases at liquor stores and grocery stores. It is great to learn about each step in this supply chain, but it is even better to reflect on how each step can become more sustainable, because if we make beer production sustainable, we will forever have the ability to enjoy a nice cold brew.
Farm inputs are variables that go into the production of a farm commodity. Farm inputs may look different from farm to farm, but they will all lead to a final amount of barley being produced. This overall amount of barley produced in each area highly affects its price. The decisions a farmer makes can affect how much barley is being produced. Some of these decisions include choosing a specific seed type, how soil is being maintained, and how plants are being maintained. Another input that should be accounted for is transportation. Once the barley has been harvested, it is transported to malting facilities, similar to how other types of grain are transported to mills. Farmers will use a statistical analysis to determine how much of a commodity is being produced, as well as determining the price of the commodity. The graph on the left shows how the production of barley has changed over a given time period. From 1981 to 2017, the total yearly production of barley decreased by approximately 500,000 tons. The graph on the right shows how the price of barley has changed over a given time period. There has been an average increase in the price of barley. An increase in barley prices results in malting companies paying more. When comparing the two graphs, we can see that the graphs are inversely related, showing correlation.
After the barley is taken from the farm, it is transported to another facility to begin the malting process. Malting is a multi-step process in which the barley is germinated in moist conditions to be ready for brewing at the next step of the supply chain. Malt is the raw product that is brewed in that step. The malting process is separated into 4 distinct steps: cleaning and sizing, steeping, germination, and kilning. Each of these steps adds value to the final product. Cleaning and sizing is the process in which the raw barley taken from the farm is prepared for the malting process by cleaning it and separating it based on what kind of barley is received. From here, it is ready for the steeping step of the process. During the steeping process, the grain is moistened and mixed to begin the germination process. The grains are immersed and air-rested sequentially over a period of 2 to 3 days in order to evenly hydrate and germinate the grains. The next step of the process is germination. During this step, the grains begin to grow in a fresh, humid, and temperature-controlled environment. This process takes around 4 days to complete. The purpose of germination is to develop enzyme systems, soluble nitrogen and free amino nitrogen, and to break down cell walls in order to create the specific product made for whichever brewer or distiller the product will be transported to after the malting is complete. Finally, the barley goes through kilning. This is the process in which the grain is dried to prepare it for transportation to breweries and distilleries. At this step, the maltster can give the grain the color and flavor of their choosing through changing the temperature and the amount of air that the grain is exposed to during the kilning. After the kilning is complete, the malted grain is ready to be transported to breweries for fermentation. During this transportation, the malt barley is placed in lined sacks to avoid contamination from the atmosphere, such as salt. The The purpose of the malting step in the supply chain is to prepare the grain that comes from the farm for the fermentation step at the breweries. Therefore, the malting step in the supply chain adds value to the final product by making permanent, tangible changes to the product from its original form. Notably, the steeping, germination, and kilning steps makes chemical changes to the product to better prepare the grain for fermentation. For example, the kilning step makes changes to the product that directly suit the specific needs of the maltster's direct customers. These permanent changes made to the grain from its original form are the added value of this step in the supply chain of barley.
Once malting is complete, the barley is then transported to breweries. Once received, the barley undergoes 8 steps of production: milling, mash conversion, lautering, boiling, wort separation and cooling, fermentation, maturation, and lastly, filtration and storage. The first step of the process involves creating a substance called grist, which is an assortment of crushed together malt. The grist is then heated through a process called mash conversion, which aims to convert the malt starch into sugar. Following mash conversion, the product is lautered, meaning the grain husks are mechanically separated from the product, leaving behind a sweet liquid called wort. The sweet liquid is then boiled down, and the hops are added to the boiling mixture. The wort is then separated once more through a whirlpool technique. The leftover substance then undergoes cooling and fermentation. Yeast is added before fermentation, which reacts with the wort to create alcohol. Carbon dioxide is also added during the fermentation process. The beer then undergoes 3 to 4 weeks of maturation before it's ready to be transported to the final cellar, like the LCBO, etc. Value added through the process of brewing can be attributed to malt fermentation and secondly canning. During the process of fermentation, the malt is added to sugar water prior to the metabolization of the water into carbon dioxide and alcohol. The product then undergoes the process of canning. For some breweries, the supply chain ends here. However, some firms sell to a final distributor which continues the chain. Each step of the brewing process creates an accumulative addition of value to the product. For example, the development of grist from only harvested malt, and shortly after the development of wort from the grist, and so on. Each efficient step in the process succeeds in adding value to the final product of packaged beer.
So after the brewing process, the breweries will now transport their beer to a final distributor where the product is actually going to the customer, or we should say sell it to the customer. So there are a couple examples for the final distributor. They can be the LCBO, the beer store, or maybe other grocery stores. And for the right hand side of the slice is a graph about the price of 6 packs of beer in US since year 2000. So this graph actually shows the price that customer will pay for the final product. And we can see this correlation between the change in price and years is the same as the correlation at the farm level. Generally speaking, we can see there is a slight and slow increase from the graph over years and years. We got another graph which is about the annual Canadian consumption of beer per capita. So from the graph, there are 2 colors of line. The blue one is related to Ontario consumption, and the red one is going to be national consumption. The time period for this graph is from 2014 to 2019. And the graph is showing the average annual consumption of beer per capita in Ontario is 7.13 liter. And the average annual Canadian consumption of beer per capita is 76.20 liter. And when we are seeing the graph, we can actually see there is a downward trend in the consumption of beer per capita for both Ontario and Canada. So since the price of barley have increased in the past 26 years, and the cost ratios for the general income is actually putting a decrease, so demand for beer is actually getting lower. And we can see the consumption graph of beer actually representing as a demand curve, which known as shifts to the left and inward. This is because the demand for beer in Ontario is less than the national demand of Canada.
At the final stage of the supply chain of beer, value is added to the product through sales and branding the specific products to brand name companies. The larger the brand name, the higher the value added. This is because cost of production remains constantly lower than the price of the sale, and the price of the sale increases according to the brand name. Branding adds value to the product in that the demand for these brand names is higher than a generic or an unbranded product. Some larger names in the beer industry include Heineken and Bud Light. This branding increases the price for the final consumer over what the producers paid, which further decreases the farmer's share of each sale, thus increasing the share to the brand names. This is the final addition of value and the final stage in the supply chain of beer production.